So I'm not going to read the passage. Now, my wife, bless her heart, in helping me, she would say, why didn't you get one of the kids to ask? And I thought about that. I did, but the thought occurred to me while the service was going on. And I thought, that would be a great idea. We have some teenagers that read really well. But I would have been asking them at the last minute. And there's some pressure that comes in standing up here and reading. And if you look at Daniel chapter 1, it is filled with jawbreaker words. And I didn't want to do that to them. So that's why. So I'm going to bypass the main passage, which is all of chapter 1. I have a couple of other verses I will share. So I will be sharing God's words with you. But Daniel chapter 1 is the basis for all that I share with you today. In sharing, to be a bit understated, and with more than a bit of tongue-in-cheek, I think it's safe to say that we are living in strange and unfamiliar times. 2 verses of Scripture, I think, express this really well. Hebrews 11:13 says, and this is the chapter of God's Hall of Faith, these all died in faith, having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on earth. And then 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, he writes, I urge you as sojourners and exiles, strangers, sojourners, exiles. Up until recent years, these descriptions were foreign to us. We have lived here, probably all of us, all of our lives. We have felt very much at home until recently. Now we are beginning to understand what Peter and the writer to the Hebrews meant in their descriptions. Our beliefs and opinions are no longer welcome. Our societal institutions have turned against us, and the law decreasingly protects us. Tim Keller, one of my favorite authors, and I think the finest theologian of this century, wrote this: we are entering a new era in which there is not only no social benefit to being a Christian, but an actual social cost. In many places, culture is becoming increasingly hostile toward faith, producing people for whom Christianity is not only offensive, but incomprehensible. As our nation continues to trend towards secularism and the modern paganism that comes with it, we are being pushed hard. And we are being forced to become outsiders. It makes us uncomfortable, and we don't like it. And it's easy to become angry, defensive, and defeated. So how are we to live in a land that is becoming unrecognizable to us? How do we keep our courage and our hope? How do we keep from fearfully retreating into isolationism? I believe that Daniel and his 3 friends show us how. Conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, deported to Shinar. Where have we heard that word Shinar before? In Genesis 11. The Tower of Babel was built in Shinar, that architectural statement of defiance and rebellion against God. And in my mind, I can hear Daniel's people, having forgotten about their sin and their idolatry, having forgotten how they ignored God's law and the warnings of the prophets. I can hear them saying, how could God let this happen? Where is he? Have we followed him for nothing? In what kind of world will our children grow up? My hope with this series, we'll cover at least the first half of the book, maybe all of it, but my hope is to encourage you to deepen your faith in God, because he has not changed in the last 2,500 years. As he was with Daniel and his friends in Shinar, so is he with us today. And you and I can live with courage and hope in this strange land. There are 4 things I wish to share with you today. And the first of these is say no. Say no. King Nebuchadnezzar had brought the cream of the crop of the Jewish nation to the palace in Babylon. He was going to refashion them into good, productive citizens of his empire. But to do that, he needed to change their worldview. Changing locations is powerful in changing people. Sadly, we often see this happen when our kids attend secular university, and sometimes cast aside their faith along the way. But Nebuchadnezzar went even further by changing their education, because he knew what you read and how you think changes who you are. It alters our priorities. It shapes our moral values. And then he gave them new names, new identities, foisting upon them an identity that aligned with Babylonian religion. And there was one last step that he tried to take. The king wanted to change their diet. And it was here that Daniel and his friends said no. Now, up till now, they went along with the program. They had to if they wanted to stay alive. They allowed themselves to be separated from home and family and make that 1,000-mile journey. They accepted the names that had been placed upon them. They went along with the entire program, but here, with their diet, here was an opportunity to have a choice. And their choice was to say no. Now that leads me to the second thing, and that is, after we say no, we must show resolve. You and I may look at this and think, how odd. This is just food. I mean, I love to eat. If it don't crawl off my plate, I'm going to get it. It's just food. They're not being asked to do anything illegal. They're not being asked to do anything immoral. They're not being asked to bow down and worship some kind of statue. Just eat. Came from the king's kitchen. It's good stuff. And it may seem strange to us, but that's because we're not Jewish. See, for the Jew, especially the Orthodox, what one eats and drinks is an outward expression of what they believe it means to be a people who belong to God. For these 4 young men, I don't know, somewhere between the ages of 14 and 21, everything had been taken from them. Their diet was the only thing they had left that connected them to their faith and to their heritage, and they refused to allow that tie to be severed. Sometimes the hatred that the world has for us is well-deserved. I say that because we can really be ugly. We can really be obnoxious. We can lose sight of grace, and we need to remember, especially when the pressure is being applied, that we can be godly without being offensive. Look at these young men in chapter 1. They had winsome personalities. They found favor with their Babylonian captivities. In fact, the man who was in charge had a special liking with Daniel. There was just something about his personality that drew him in and was winsome. He really liked the young man. They were on time. They were good students. They worked hard. And when it came to this matter of diet, when it came time where they felt that they had to say no, if you look here in the chapter, they made their stand with humility, with respect, with courtesy. They could have thrown a fit. Or they could have gone the other way and say, look, times have changed. All the other guys who came with us, they're eating what's put before them. We're not in Jerusalem anymore. We need to fit in. We need to be relevant. Let's not quibble over food. Go along and get along. No, they determined where they needed to draw the lines for themselves, so to speak. And they did so with grace and respect in taking their stand. The third thing that I see here in their lives and for us is to test it. Test it. When Daniel presents his plan to the chief eunuch, he meets resistance. This man rightfully feared for his life. If he goes against the king's edict, he forfeits his life. So he turns Daniel down. Now, does Daniel have a fit? Or does he just throw up his hands and give in? No, he just bypasses the head guy and goes to the steward who provides the food, and he asked him to bring them vegetables and water as a 10-day experiment. And that 10-day experiment ended up lasting all 3 years of their education. And the chapter tells us these four were superior to their classmates in every single way. Not because of their diet, but because of their faithfulness to God and the power that God has. It wasn't because of Texas superfoods. It was because of the supernatural. And over the next 3 years, every day that they got up and they looked in the mirror, these four young men were reminded of the faithfulness and the provision of God. So after you've said no, and you've shown resolved, and you've put it to the test, the last thing we need to do is stand firm. So far we know none of the other Jewish young men and boys who went into exile with these four joined them in their stance. So how did these four know where to draw the line? I imagine the peer pressure had to be immense. Are you crazy? You're going to risk your life? You're going to deny yourself? We can feast like a king? What's wrong with you? How did they know where to draw the line? And once it was drawn, how did they find the courage to keep that stand? I believe it was their wisdom and courage that sprang from their knowledge of God. If you look at verse 2, the Lord gave. In verse 9, God gave. In verse 17, God gave. God gave because God is in control. Oh yeah, Nebuchadnezzar would take the credit. Look how great I am. This nation of Judah, which has never been defeated, I did it. He would take the credit, but it was God who gave Nebuchadnezzar victory over Judah. It was God who sent his people into exile. It was God who allowed his temple to be destroyed. God took Daniel and his friends into Babylon. And I love this. This isn't in the notes. This is extra. It won't cost you anything. I love this. There's a passage in Ezekiel. I really need to take the time to research, but I love this. Ezekiel prophesies, says Ichabod, the glory is departed. And in that setting, the vision that God gave Ezekiel was the Shekinah glory cloud of God that hovered over the temple site, literally lifted up into the sky and followed those exiles to Babylon. God was with them. He didn't abandon them when they were taken away. He was with them in Babylon. He worked through them in Babylon. God was in control then, and God is in control today. He is. Back in Jerusalem, before the Babylonian crisis, Daniel and his friends, every morning upon rising, and at night before climbing into bed, they would recite Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Even though Daniel's life has been eviscerated, he was not going to stop loving the God that he knew. Loving the God who stood behind all things, including the worst things. In a few minutes, we're going to have a benediction, we're going to greet each other, and then we're going to go where we live. We're going to go in our residences. But what we need to remember, even though I'm driving back home over into Pleasant Township, I'm not home yet. And neither are you. We're not home. Essentially, we are in Babylon. But God is with us, and He is sovereign. Amen. And in spite of all the appearances, the things that we see and read and hear and experience, nothing is actually out of control. Crises will come. The pressure will be applied to make us conform. And so now, before the hammer drops, now is the time for you and I to prayerfully, thoughtfully, and carefully set those boundaries that we will not cross. And please understand, we may not set the same boundaries. So let us not be harsh and judgmental if our boundaries don't align with each other. For example, Christian teachers. Some will choose to remain in public school. Some will leave to teach privately or in Christian schools. Some parents will choose to keep their kids in public schools, while others will choose private school or homeschooling. Where you and I draw our lines are not going to be the same boundaries. Because remember, God gifts us, calls us, and equips us, and sets us in different places according to His purposes. So if our boundaries don't line up, let's not be harsh, but let's be affirming and encouraging, realizing that God works in us His plan that is unique to us. I end with a quote from Alistair Begg. He is a great writer. He's from England, pastors in Cleveland, Ohio, has a wonderful ministry. So, know your lines, and know the God who will give you all you need in the situation He has put you into to enable you to stand firm for Him and say, no, I'm not going to give in. Know your lines. Set your boundaries. Let's stand.